Löw-Beer. I'm a visiting grad student from Germany here at the Gant Institute, and I'm very happy to introduce Meryl to you today. Meryl is an agroecologist who works here for the Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security team for a year now on the theme 3, which is Poor Climate Change Mitigation. She received her BA and BE in Environmental Engineering from Dartmouth. Is that correct? Great. It's easier to say where she got the Ph.D. because it's here. Her doctoral research was on correlations between tree biodiversity and carbon sequestration on smallholder shade coffee farms and the contribution of crop diversity to food security among maize and coffee farmers in El Salvador. And I have to say that we from the library are particularly excited about your presentation today because we have been discussing in the last weeks a lot the question of how to communicate climate change effectively and at the same time adequately. And so we are very excited to hear whether greenhouse gas calculators for agriculture can be something that we can use in our communication.
Great. Hopefully I'll have all the answers. Yeah, so thanks, David. And as David mentioned, we were talking about greenhouse gas calculators for agriculture. And this is some work that I have been working on with colleagues at the World Agroforestry Center and also the International Center for Tropical Agriculture in Colombia. So I have a lot of collaborators, and I'll give you all their names at the end. So before I sort of dive into the meat of the talk, I just wanted to give a little bit of introduction about CCAFs and who we are and who are these odd trolls that hang out in that little office under the stairs.
That's normally how we describe
you. I work for the CGIAR research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security. And there are several focus areas within that program. One is long-term adaptation to climate change and also climate information services for farmers. And I work in the low emissions development theme. We used to be the pro-poor mitigation theme, now we're sort of changing our name a little bit. And we also have a whole research theme on moving from field practices to policy. So what are the linkages between what is happening on farms, adaptation and mitigation, and policies for those practices. We have about 200 plus scientists in 20 countries, and they are based at the various CGIAR research centers. The CGIAR is an international consortium on agriculture and agricultural research. It's focused on developing countries, and it's been around, the consortium has been around since 1971, but some of the member centers actually predate the consortium. So it's a global research program, and we have work going on all over the world. Here at UVM, there are 5 of us working for CCAFs. Leanie Wallenberg, who I think most of you all of you in the gun know, is the head of the Low Emissions Development Program. And then myself, I'm the science officer for the Low Emissions Development Program, which is sort of equivalent to a postdoc. Juliana is our amazing program management and communications person. And then we have 2 fairly new members. One is Lindsay Barbieri, who I think I saw, there she is, a new graduate student working with Leanie, and then Sonia, I always pronounce her name improperly, Guglian Gluck, is an undergraduate student at Resner, and she's helping us with some work starting this semester. So that's our team. So, and now to get into sort of the meat of the talk, first I'll talk about what is the problem that we've been trying to address, which is how to measure agriculture's contribution to climate change mitigation and why that's a difficult question. And then I'll talk about one solution or one potential solution or tool, which is these greenhouse gas calculators that are being developed. And the sort of meat or the data part is how I've been comparing how close they actually come to field measurements. So one of the great opportunities with the CCAPS program is that we actually have field-based measurements of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture going on at multiple sites globally. And that's given us an opportunity to sort of compare, on-farm data with some of these tools and calculations that are coming out. And lastly, what's some of the work that we're doing to improve these and also to improve quantification of greenhouse gases from agriculture in general. So first of all, why are we looking at climate change in agriculture, and particularly climate change mitigation in agriculture? Because we don't usually think, or in general, globally, the discussion isn't about agriculture as a major driver of climate change, aside from deforestation. But agriculture contributes about 16 to 22% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And that's both land use change resulting from agriculture and direct agricultural emissions. The agriculturally driven deforestation is a fairly large part of that, but direct agricultural emissions aren't insignificant. And usually when we're talking about direct agricultural emissions, it's methane and nitrous oxide. In terms of carbon dioxide, agriculture can be a net sink for greenhouse gases. Just sort of an overview for those of you who aren't so familiar with greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Some of the major sources are enteric methane emissions. You can see the little cow over there. And also nitrous oxide from application of fertilizers to croplands. Rice is also a relatively large source of methane, especially in areas of Asia that are big rice-producing countries, obviously. And then soil carbon and biomass can be a net sink for greenhouse gas emissions, but when those areas are converted to agriculture, there's a net contribution of carbon dioxide. So those are sort of the major sources that we'll be talking about. There are mitigation opportunities within agriculture. This is from the IPCC, this is from the AR4 report. The major opportunities tend to be related to carbon and soils, obviously, because carbon is a huge sink, or soils are a huge sink for carbon. Grazing land management, cropland management. The opportunities for methane and nitrous oxide tend to be comparatively lower, but there's also a little bit more certainty around those. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So why is measuring this so difficult? Why is quantifying emissions from agriculture so difficult? One reason is that it's first of all, there's uncertainty around what's actually happening in the landscape. So say compared with vehicle emissions, and I apologize to those of you who work in transportation because you may think it's probably more complicated than I'm making it out to be. But say, with vehicle emissions, we roughly know what combustion of gasoline, what that produces in terms of emissions, and we roughly know how many cars are on the road because there are records of that and how much they're being driven. With agriculture, we not only is there uncertainty around what's actually happening on farms, and this is particularly true in developing countries where you have a lot of small farms and very diverse agricultural activities happening on them, and not necessarily a huge, annual census or a huge data collection effort around that. Secondarily, there's also a really strong and uncertain interaction between the activities that are happening and the resulting emissions. So, for example, application of fertilizer to agricultural soils, the nitrous oxide emissions that result from that depend very heavily on the climate, on the water quantity that's currently in the soil even at a particular time during the growing season, and temperature and multiple other factors that aren't necessarily easily predicted, say at the beginning of a growing season. The same is also true with soil carbon, which is very, very spatially heterogeneous. Even within a single field, there can be great spatial variability. And so the interaction between management practices and emissions is also very uncertain. And so what this leads to is high uncertainty, particularly from developing countries, in the information that's coming out of them in terms of their agricultural emissions. And this just sort of gives you an idea of the current level of, the current tier of reporting from developing countries to the UNFCCC. Some of the, the countries with higher agricultural emissions, like Brazil and India, they tend to have developed country-specific emission factors for reporting, so their data is, there's higher precision associated with it. But from many other countries, there's a fairly, they're using much coarser methods for measurement and quantification. And this isn't necessarily supposed to be a value thing in terms of, these countries are good, these are bad. It's just what we know currently. So how do we actually measure greenhouse gas emissions and reductions? A couple examples of techniques that some of you might be familiar with. Sort of the standard method for measuring emissions from soils is what's called a static chamber. And you can see there, it's essentially this box that you put on top of the soil. Part of the bottom of it is embedded into the soil, and then you take samples of the gases at various intervals. This method is, the reason it's so widely used is because it's relatively inexpensive. These boxes can actually be built out of trash cans. The thing that's expensive is then analyzing the samples, for which you usually need a gas chromatograph, and I see a couple people chuckling. I believe we actually have one at UVM, although I can't say exactly where it's located. An alternative is an eddy covariance system, which is not used very often in developing countries because, one, it tends to be fairly expensive. I think it's around starting at $30K or $50K, and when it's left in, say, a field setting in a developing country, it tends to get stolen or broken, or the cows running over monkeys, or various data interference problems. And also, these tend to be more applicable in homogeneous landscapes, but if you have a farm where you have multiple activities going on, you're not actually quantifying what's happening from each of those activities. Quantifying emissions from animals is even more complex. You'll see up there what one of my colleagues and I refer to as a cow in a box. And it's formally called a respiration chamber, but it is essentially a cow in a box. It's sort of the equivalent to the static chamber method for the soil that allows you to monitor methane emissions. Obviously, this is a fairly complex, well, it is a fairly complex method, and you have to have a cow living in the box for, several weeks at least. But one of the major challenges for enteric methane emissions is that they vary mostly with feed intake of the animal. And so if you can, if you have an animal that you have a standard feed intake and you know what it's eating, then you can fairly easily establish relationships between feed intake and methane emissions. But for grazing animals, it's a lot more complex because you don't necessarily know what they're eating in the field, particularly in grazing systems where it's not an intensively managed pasture. So establishing those relationships is very complex. So one possible solution, or one tool that there's lots of people, particularly in academia and in the private sector, trying to develop are calculators that don't require very or aren't very demanding in terms of data inputs. So you don't need, to know, say, the current soil organic matter content of soil in, every area that you're measuring, or you don't need to know, exactly what your animal is eating. Because, with the expensive measurement, we can't possibly measure every single system. And so this is a way, not only of, say, providing a way for non-experts to use this data, but also, if you have multiple activities on a certain farm, these calculators are sort of able to combine them into, one overall calculation. And they're being used, I'll give you a couple examples of where they're being used. So I'm going to talk about a few calculators today. The two main ones that I'll talk about are Xact, which is an ex-ante carbon calculator that's been developed by FAO, and the CoolFarm tool, which has actually been developed with collaboration with some people at the Sustainable Food Lab, which is down in, I always forget if it's Heartland or Hartford, in Vermont, and also with the University of Aberdeen. So this just sort of gives you an idea of what some of these calculators look like. This is the user interface for the Xact calculator. And, is that a laser? No, okay.
You play with your little pad, like the mouse player.
Oh, okay. Oh, good idea. So how it works is you basically start by putting in basic information about your farm, about the climate, the moisture regime, and just general soil type. And it's a very general soil
In
type.
climate, there's like words that mean something.
Yeah.
Like tropical, subhumid, I don't know.
Yeah. And then you can there's actually a tab that allows you to sort of look up what the different climate, it's a fairly coarse map, so you kind of have to look at it very carefully to figure out climate type. And soil types, it's basically, are you dealing with wetland soils, or are you dealing with high activity clay soils or low activity clay soils? And then I can go, if anyone's interested, I can sort of go into more detail afterwards. But then there are basically multiple modules. There's a land use change, cropland, grassland, degradation, and inputs modules. And in each of those, you sort of put in the general activities that are going on the farm. So with land use change, it's, do you anticipate any land is going to be changed from, say, forest to cropland, or from, wetland to agroforestry system, or something like that. In cropland, it's just basically, are you changing from one management type to another? So are you changing from, say, conventional management to, no-till with more intensive crop residues, or are you adding a cover crop, or something like that? Grassland, you do need to put in, the number of animals. Are you intensively managing the grassland? Are you adding extra fertilizer inputs or extra, manure inputs, not from the animals that are on the grassland? And then the inputs deals with infrastructure. So, are you implementing a project where, you're going to be building, say, a new silo or something like that, and also fertilizer inputs. And so what you're putting into the tool basically has to do with any changes that you're making in terms of how the farm is managed. And then it essentially gives you an output, a result of here's how much carbon is going to be sequestered by your project, and here's the change in nitrous oxide and methane emissions that we would anticipate.
Question, does it lay it out over time? Because this is a dynamic thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you make a sort of a step function change in management, and then over years, the impacts vary.
Yeah, it does with carbon sequestration. And you can also change the way in which or the way in which the change is going to be happening. So you can use a step function, or you can also sort of use a gradual linear increase over time. So each year a little bit more of the land area in your project area is being changed to this management practice. And then it will give you, it doesn't necessarily give you any sort of function over time, but it gives you, after 20 years, this is going to be your change, and then it gives you an annualized value. So it's it's a fairly rough tool.
Is this open source? Anyone can
Mhm.
use it?
Yep. Yeah, and you can download it from FAO's website. And so this shows you part of the output page, not the entire output page. But you see it sort of separates things into land use changes, agriculture, and then grassland and livestock. Gives you the share of the balance per greenhouse gas, and then it gives you the results per year. And then the total balance. And you can also, say if you want to do a value chain assessment and you have values for transportation and loss of waste and things like that, you can sort of do a simple value chain assessment in the outputs as well.
So who, can you talk a little bit more about the audience in terms of who is actively using it and is not behind it?
Sure, yeah, so I've got,
Oh, sorry.
oh no, it's okay, I promise I'll get there in a couple
Great.
slides. So I just want to show you, this is the CoolFarm tool, so this also used to be Excel-based, and now it's a web-based tool. And it's fairly similar to Xact. The main difference is that this is a more farm scale calculator. It's intended to be more farm scale. Xact is more of a landscape scale calculator. So here you can really it allows you to enter more detail in terms of, say, exactly what type of fertilizers you're using or manure and what quantity you're applying to the farm, and what specific crops are going to be grown and how many trees might you be adding, or how many trees are already there. So in terms of the farm scale, it allows you to get more precise estimations, and it has basically the same activities that you can put in as Xact, crops, grasslands. It also includes energy and processing, which is a little bit different from Xact. And here transport is also sort of included as part of the calculator. And that's because this was really developed for a commodity crop audience, or a private sector audience. So let me go there first. So Xact was developed by FAO, by a team at FAO, and it's mostly been used for ex-ante project analysis. So these are development projects. They're not even always necessarily carbon projects. Some are, for example, EFAD has an adaptation program where they're providing extra funds on top of regular EFAD grants for adaptation in agriculture. But they also have wanted to get some idea of what will be the mitigation impact of those investments, and so they've asked FAO to do an ex-ante analysis of that. It's also been used for a few biocarbon fund projects, some World Bank projects, projects funded by the Global Environment Facility. So it's sort of for these global investors in agriculture have been using it the most. There have also been some within country applications. Say a country is implementing a policy to improve productivity of, say, the cattle sector, and they want to know, okay, what will be the greenhouse gas impacts of that? You might be used for that. The CoolFarm tool has been much more aimed, or it's been developed in collaboration with the private sector. So Unilever, Heineken, PepsiCo, Marks and Spencer, there's Yara, there are several, a lot more companies that have been involved in its development. And so for them, it's really been used for looking at greenhouse gas, or the carbon footprint is a term used a lot in the private sector, of their supply chains, for communicating with the public, or just for their own knowledge. But it's also started to be used even within research. So there have been a couple projects, especially at the Maize and Wheat Research Center, the CIMMYT, where they've used the CoolFarm tool to estimate the greenhouse gas impacts of agricultural practices that are aimed at other purposes. So say practices that are looking at water conservation, or conservation tillage or reduced tillage, where they don't necessarily have the funds within that research project to be measuring greenhouse gas emissions, but they want to get some idea of what the effect is going to be. So that's why there's been sort of a lot of interest in this within CCAPs, because these tools are starting to be used for research, and what they're asking is how close are we actually getting to if we were to say measure. So just as an example of the kind of methodologies that are used within these tools, this is for nitrous oxide calculation, so soil nitrous oxide emissions. Xact uses the IPCC default factor, which is 1% of nitrogen applied to soils as fertilizer will be emitted as nitrous oxide. The CoolFarm tool uses the Bowman model, which accounts for multiple other factors, so the rate of nitrogen application and the interaction with the type of fertilizer, the crop type, soil texture, soil organic carbon, soil drainage, pH, and also the climate. And so it's able to be a little more precise in terms of nitrous oxide emissions, but it also requires more data inputs because you need to know all of those factors. Just a couple other examples for comparison that I'm not going to necessarily talk about much more. The USAID has an agriculture, forestry, and other land use calculator that also uses default emission factors. The Carbon Benefits Project is another, I wouldn't even necessarily call it a calculator because it's a tool that also gets into modeling and much more precise methods. And so that calculator uses also IPCC Tier 1 defaults, or you can also define your own as the user. So that's just sort of for comparison with some of the other tools that are out there. So what we've done is actually take some of the measurement data that's being collected by the World Agroforestry Center in Kenya and Tanzania, and also in several rice systems in Vietnam, Cambodia, and I'll show you the specific examples in a second. And we've compared that with what's coming out of these tools. And so in general, these are the results for Xact. And if you're close to the one-to-one line, that means that there's a fairly close relation, or the estimate is fairly close to what we've measured. In general, rice is the crop that these calculators seem to be able to estimate best, and I'll talk about why that is in a minute. Other annual crops, the emissions are generally fairly low, so it's hard to see on this graph, but the tools tend to overestimate a bit. And perennial systems are sort of all over the map, and I'll show you specifically in a second.
Alright, so the X's and dots are what you measured, not what they modeled, and the model is the line,
The y-axis is what we measured, the x-axis is what we measured, and the y-axis is what was predicted. So this, basically,
So each one is a different plot, maybe, or something?
yeah, so each one is a different treatment.
Got it.
Yeah.
So what does measured / modeled mean?
So there were a couple examples, and actually I removed them from this chart, where for livestock systems there's basically no data or no measured data, and so there were a couple examples where researchers had used process-based models, basically models of the rumen of the livestock, and we compared that data with these tools because that was
They're not here.
no, but they're not here. Yeah,
Can I ask one more question?
sure.
You said at least Xact was all about change, right? You entered
Mhm.
like, we're changing this to this, we're changing that to that. So it seemed like that was kind of a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what this is too, or is the rice value sort of the annual emission you'd expect from rice?
This is the annual emissions you'd expect from rice.
Okay, so
Yeah,
Xact can
very
do that
good.
too. It doesn't just tell you change. with
Yeah,
percentage,
yeah,
just
so-
the standard current
Yeah,
emission.
the emphasis is on, it's sort of intended for measuring changes, but it will also tell you, okay, the emissions will be this from this system.
And everything else is zero, basically, because rice has those significant emissions you mentioned earlier, the methane emissions.
Yeah. So this, actually, let me show you both of them on the same one. So the CoolFarm tool, I'll show you why these blue dots are so different between the two in just a second. The CoolFarm tool, it tends to overestimate, but it's a bit more predictable in terms of its overestimation. Xact, sometimes it was over, sometimes it was under, and this I think is because the emissions that we were comparing with were farm scale. So these were actually measured emissions from a field, and that's sort of the scale that CoolFarm tool was really intended for.
With some of the, particularly the N2O emissions, it seems like the estimate mechanism that you were using is accounting for potentially downstream emissions in degassing, say from groundwater that starts flowing as surface water and releases N2O. So if you're comparing this to plot-based measurements,
Mhm.
you would expect the plots to be lower than sort of the whole system estimate, right?
Yeah, right, and that's actually something that when the CoolFarm tool estimates, it does include those indirect emissions. And so we actually separated out the indirect emissions. So the CoolFarm tool estimate would actually be even a little bit higher, but because we were comparing with the plot, we wanted to make sure we were comparing, apples and apples.
Is that carbon dioxide emission or nitrogen emission?
It's carbon dioxide
Yeah.
equivalents. So it's N2O and CH4 converted to carbon dioxide. The conversion factor is, they changed it, so I always forget which. Nitrous oxide is 298 and methane is, let's say 25. Can you correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, so this really shows you what's going on in terms of these tools. So this is a comparison between, it's data taken from a 2012 paper that's comparing a full sun coffee system and a shade coffee system. And the sources and sinks that were considered were nitrous oxide from soils, biomass carbon, and soil carbon. And so the what's happening with Xact is Xact only, which is the green bars that you can see up there, it only assumes biomass carbon sequestration when there is land use change. So when you're changing from one land use to another. Whereas with the CoolFarm tool, if you have trees on the farm, it's accumulating, or it's assuming that there's accumulation of carbon in the biomass of those trees, even if they aren't necessarily newly planted. Now the thing with Xact is you can go into the emission factors that it's using and put in growth rates for your trees. So the assumption is 0, but you can go in and put a growth rate so that you can get some estimation there. But we sort of wanted to show, what the default would be, and so that's what we're comparing with. The other reason that I think there is an underestimation with the tools is, as Bob mentioned, the time frame. So, it's really, these are long-term changes, and in annualizing them, there's always going to be some uncertainty and loss of precision. So the measure data was annualizing over 7 years, but they didn't know exactly when the plantations were planted. And so then, the CoolFarm tool is also using some, it's using a longer annualization period. And so there's some, loss of precision there. In general, the Xact would be improved by using more specific emission factors, but by default, this is what you're getting out of it. So this is data from rice in Cambodia. And as you can see here, rice is, everyone loves working with rice in my field because it's pretty easy to predict what's going to happen. It's for whatever reason, it's just the most predictable system. And so this is comparing basically the several treatments that it's comparing were continuous flooding and then alternate wetting, which here is called SRI, which stands for Sustainable Rice Intensification. So it's basically a system where, there's lots of other components, but part of the season the rice is not flooded. And so that reduces methane emissions because you're reducing the amount of time that the soil is in anaerobic conditions. So you can see in general the tools are overestimating methane emissions. But the important thing is how good are they able to compare the difference between when you shift from continuous flooding to a system of intermittent flooding. And if you look at the change between the continuous flooding system and the intermittent flooding system, it's relatively, well, in some cases it's relatively comparable in terms of scale to the change in the actual measured data. But what's interesting is the change that it's predicting is still a little bit larger than what's actually happening in the field. So even though rice is, say, the easiest one to predict, there's still some difficulty in predicting this with tools. Sure.
You can hold it off on it.
No.
But it looks like the no fertilizer and the mineral fertilizer had similar kinds of emissions. So manure seems to have higher emissions, but isn't the manure coming from someplace and gonna be there anyway? You know what I mean? It's
Mhm.
not like we're adding new manure to the system, they just happen to put it on that site, so now you're measuring on that site.
Mhm.
So, is that true? So it may or may not be adding more,
Yeah, yeah.
emissions to the world.
Yeah, that's an important point too, that, these calculators, you have to set some boundary of what you're using, or, and usually the boundary set, especially with the CoolFarm tool, is the farm. And so if you're exporting the manure off farm, that counts as no emissions. So, is that, obviously those emissions are going somewhere, but because it's a farm level calculator, whereas if you're applying them to the field, then those emissions are still coming from the farm.
Yeah, because otherwise the message might be, mineral fertilizers emit less.
Yeah,
But using what's already on site and above that
Yeah.
might be.
yeah.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. And also the reason, so you'll also see that the bars with Xact are the same regardless of those inputs. And that's because, well, first of all, that's because here we're just looking at methane. So we're not accounting for nitrous oxide here. But also you can only account, in Xact you can only account for one input of organic material. And so if you're both leaving crop residues on the farm and then adding manure, you can only put in one of those. And so, it's there's limited flexibility in terms of, of what you can account for. Whereas with the CoolFarm tool, you can put in, multiple organic inputs. Okay, and now nitrous, to nitrous oxide emissions. So this is data that was measured in Kenya and Zimbabwe. And it's not, so, obviously both the tools overestimate. Xact is especially overestimating in this really high manure application case. And this isn't that surprising because, these are the factors and models that are included in these tools are global. And when you're comparing them with data from systems that are very low nutrient, these are naturally low fertility soils, and historically the nitrogen inputs have been very low. Sort of the recent scientific thinking is that when you start applying nitrogen to these soils, it's actually sort of a step function. So until you reach a certain threshold, basically none of that nitrogen will be emitted because it's all being taken up by plants. Because they're so nitrogen starved in general. Whereas the way these factors work, it's assumed that it's just sort of a linear function. So this isn't terribly surprising, and it's not necessarily a fault of the tool. It's sort of where our knowledge is right now in terms of nitrous oxide emissions from soils. And this is similar data on maize. And the reason that you don't see any green bars for Xact on many of these is because Xact doesn't account for nitrous oxide emissions from crop residues or from nitrogen fixing cover crops, whereas with CoolFarm tool you can do that. So only the example or only the data point where there's mineral fertilizer applied do you see an Xact data point. And then this is a comparison. This isn't my work, but a colleague did some work comparing again the CoolFarm tool with model data. So basically, you're comparing sort of one simplified model with a more complex process-based model. And in general, and here we're looking at the mitigation benefits. So higher bars actually mean less emissions with the interventions used. And you'll see that in general, the CoolFarm tool has sort of overestimated mitigation benefits compared to the models that they're using. And this is mainly because of our lack of knowledge about site-specific carbon sequestration, as I mentioned, is really site-specific, and also livestock emissions, because that's also very uncertain, especially in grazing systems. So how can we improve some of these calculators, or how can we make quantification, less data intensive and less expensive, but more comparable with real world data. So one of the things we really need is country-specific emission factors. So these are those emission factors are the conversion factor or the multiplier for an agricultural activity in terms of what the emissions that are going to be resulting from that agricultural activity. And most of the emission factors that we have are based on developed country data. That's basically because that's where most of the research takes place. There's been a lot of research in the US and Europe, whereas for developing countries and tropical areas, there's a lot less data. And so the emission factors that we have for temperate areas are being applied to tropical areas. So that's one of the major focus areas of our research group's work, is getting that data that we need to improve our quantification ability in tropical areas. So, and second is to calibrate models. So again, to calibrate a model, you need actual measured data. And so these are sort of the gold standard would be that we don't actually need to go out and collect data anymore. We just have great models that are calibrated for every particular area and agricultural system, and we can use those. And we're a long way from there, obviously, but there has been a lot of work, especially in Africa. This is data from a tool, or an example of a tool called Shamba, which was developed by Nicholas Berry and his team at Edinburgh University in the UK. And what they've done is they've actually calibrated one of these process-based carbon models for areas of, they started in Malawi and now they're expanding. And so this can actually be used by carbon projects or smallholder agricultural development projects in those areas where they can, it's sort of getting to the gold standard where they can go in and just put a few data inputs and get a more accurate estimate of the soil carbon that they're sequestering. So that's sort of, if we could get there for all areas, that would be amazing. And lastly is improving the availability of activity data. Because as I mentioned, it's not just the emission factors, it's also actually knowing what's going on the farms themselves. And so a couple of ideas that people have been tossing around or really excited about. Remote sensing, sort of represented by this complex diagram over here, is one that's sort of what's been used so far. But a couple newer ideas are crowdsourcing activity data. So actually, using mobile phone technology to get, farmers or, teenagers in rural areas to be actually collecting this activity data. So getting an idea of where a land use change is happening. What's the predominant agricultural system in this area? And lastly, and Lindsay and I have actually been talking about this, is using drones for collecting activity data, which I have to admit I know absolutely nothing about, but I have some colleagues that are really excited about this idea of using drones to collect not only for activity data, but even for measuring emissions, putting sensors on these sorts of drones. So who knows, maybe that's where we're going in terms of quantifying agricultural emissions. And lastly, maybe the most important point is that mitigation benefits are really only one piece of the puzzle. And so the other, huge piece of the puzzle that I haven't even touched on is how can we simultaneously be collecting information about the impacts of these practices or changes in practices on food security, on income, on soils, and on adaptation capacity. Because the different activities that are going on a farm all have interacting effects in terms of those variables as well. For example, the practice of conservation agriculture, which is basically increasing crop residue inputs, reducing tillage, and using crop rotations not only sequesters carbon, but it has also been shown to stabilize yields. It can buffer against drought by retaining more water and reduce soil erosion. And then there's been a lot of research in Africa on the effects on yields in African farming systems. So I think the overall message is that we can't necessarily let the uncertainty associated with quantification keep us from action, and in particular, hold or keep climate finance from developing countries. And in general, I would say my impression is that people aren't, especially funding agencies and NGOs that work with smallholders, aren't necessarily letting this uncertainty keep them from action. They're sort of working with the tools they have, like Xact, like the CoolFarm tool. And then as new developments and new data come out, incorporating those into their estimates. So, thank you.
So I have a question. What do you think, have you thought about how good is good enough for these tools?
That's kind of the ultimate question, is how good is good enough. And I think the answer is it depends very strongly on what you're using it for. So something that I've been discussing a lot with colleagues is the idea of a sort of tiered systems, somewhat like the IPCC tiers, but more in terms of okay, if you're using it for this type of investment, then here's the precision level that you need. If you're using it for this type of investment, here's the precision level that you need. And it depends also on what your interaction is with the carbon market. Because for carbon credits that are going to be certified and sold on the market, then there's a much higher standard of rigor. Whereas for say projects such as those EPAD investment projects that I mentioned, they don't really care too much about how precise it is, just that they have some idea of are we doing well or are we doing poorly. So it really depends on what you're using it for.
So back to this idea of change, it seems like most of those people that are investing in carbon want to see an additional sequestration of carbon relative to business as usual or something, right?
Right.
And so that makes me think two things. One, the focus of change on whatever it's called, Xact, is a good idea. But also it might be the more useful way to compare models to data. So they're all doing change, but all your comparisons were like static annual of rice.
Yeah.
But I was trying to look at your bar graphs and see whether when you added more fertilizer, did the gray bar go up and did the orange bar go up? Even though they're hugely overestimating, maybe if they changed proportionally, that's okay, because they each would report like a 30% change.
Yeah.
Since that's kind of what people who are investing in carbon projects want anyway, is a change in the outcome, maybe that makes even these wildly overestimating tools a little more robust than your graphs make them seem.
Yeah.
So that could be a different way to depict the same data
Yeah.
in a way that's more sort of on point for what they might be used for.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the hardest, or that I've sort of thought about that as well, and the people I've been working with have thought about that. And really then the problem we run into is the data that we're working with in terms of the actual field data. Because usually what these tools are showing is changes over time, say you implement this practice, and then what is the actual change. Whereas our field data is we've got this plot with this practice and this plot with this practice, and particularly with carbon sequestration, those aren't necessarily comparable, or you can't think of them in terms of a change over time. Yeah, but I think that would sort of be the important next step. And we could, but for some of the nitrous oxide and methane ones, we could look at that comparison.
So this might seem a little bit, I don't know, so maybe I'm slow, but is it an assumption of the work that you're doing here, you want to compare techniques on the farms for how much carbon they sequester, so that you're talking about developing the tool to measure the carbon so that you can give information to people about which farming techniques reduce carbon emissions.
Mhm.
Is that
Mhm.
basically it?
Yeah.
I was wondering, like, maybe in between just like a practice-based model and like the process-based model,
Mhm.
are there any like soil property type models that could be like not quite as expensive but more accurate?
So there are, the one that comes to mind is the model that's been used for nitrous oxide. So, between some of the process-based models and say the, just 1% of nitrogen, there was a model developed by Lex Bowman and a group at UNH and a couple other universities. That's just an empirical model. And so you basically have to put in, 5 variables, and then it gives you an estimate. And actually there's a group at the Maize and Wheat Research Center that I mentioned that's working to sort of reparameterize that model for tropical systems. Because when it was developed, there wasn't a lot of data from tropical systems yet. And so that is sort of a good, intermediary or intermediate approach.
As usual, this is an unfair question, but I've been at the other end of such questions, so let me try.
Sure.
You started saying that agriculture and land use accounted for something like 24% of
Mhm.
greenhouse gas emissions, and that most of that was from deforestation.
Mhm.
So what's left is what we're talking about here, unless one of your management procedures is to go back to forest, which I guess it isn't. So I guess I would just say, you've got your clients and it's fine, but when you think about that fraction of the 24% that you're really talking about,
Mhm.
and then talk about the percentage changes you could actually attain through the measures you're looking at, how big a piece of the whole pie is it? And if I'm really wired about greenhouse gases,
Yeah.
how wired should I get about this?
Yeah. So, that's a
30
totally fair
question.
question. No, it's a totally fair question. And, it's something that we sort of debate within the program all the time. And I guess, part of the answer is that this work is just focusing mostly on nitrous oxide and methane emissions on farm. But as a whole, the program's also looking at agriculture as a driver of deforestation. And so, what happens when you convert forest to agriculture? And one of the major drivers is livestock systems, particularly in the Amazon. And so part of the goal of our work is also to look at, okay, what needs to happen for that deforestation to stop? Or say, you establish a regulation that, you can't move anywhere else with your livestock. Well then, what do farmers do? And there needs to be some sort of intensification of production in the existing area. And so, some of those mitigation interventions might be, recovering degraded grasslands or, even recovering degraded croplands, such that they can stay in production and farmers don't need to deforest. Or, improving feed of animals such that you can increase production, increase milk production with the same herd size. And so part of this work, the measurement work will also be informing, okay, but if you do that, what's the trade-off in terms of comparing deforestation with, say, increased methane emissions from that intensification process? So, sort of one example.
I was just wondering if you had tillage types was one of the inputs for the model, because in the graphs you showed where they were like grossly overestimating, it seemed like the only things that you had up there were crop type and fertilizer input, the type or amount. But if those were the same, but one was a no-till or conservation tillage and one was conventional, I feel like those, you would see differences and maybe would better estimate. I didn't know if that was part of it, if that was one of the inputs you put it in the beginning or not of the models.
Right, so that's sort of a major area. So that model was just for nitrous oxide, which, and basically I think the reason that tillage wasn't in that model is because our knowledge of the interaction between tillage and fertilizer and nitrous oxide emissions is fairly limited, at least in terms of, quantifying that relationship. And tillage would be very important for CO2, but it's less, it is still important, but less important for nitrous oxide. So for example, for the carbon dioxide models that go into those tools, those definitely include tillage. But for nitrous oxide, they leave it out since it's not a major driver.
You really,
I was wondering if you're looking at different crops, because with biofuels and farm plantations and that, the expansion with land use change, and that's supposed to be one of the biggest drivers is the land use change. So I was wondering if you were looking at sort of some other crops, like the palm oil, and then you look at cattle, but do you look at goats? Because goats have much higher ammonium in their manure.
Right.
And I know
Yeah.
it's a totally different animal because they're so small. We don't think of them as that. But if you let them whack out goats,
yeah.
I
know, it just smells like goat. Xact and I believe CoolFarm tool as well, you can put in smaller livestock, but it's, the estimations are very rough. It's just how many livestock do you have, and then it calculates based on the head of livestock. Yeah.
And palm oil? Yeah.
And palm oil, you can account for it. So the way that Xact would account for it would just be an agroforestry crop or an agroforestry system. But there is also the option to put in conversion of peatlands. So if you're converting peatland to agriculture, then it would reflect the high methane emissions associated with that.
I had a quick question, sure, Dean did too. But how has Unilever and PepsiCo responded when it seems like the model they're using consistently overestimates emissions based on your?
So we haven't necessarily published this yet. So I'm not sure that they haven't seen this data yet. But I think in general they would probably rather see. Yeah, I guess you could say the tool is conservative. So it's overestimating emissions. I think they would be more interested, as Taylor mentioned, in changes between practices. But then again, sometimes they also just want a number for what are we doing right now, and what are the emissions associated with that. So I think if we could say this tool is probably giving you the top value, the cap. They say, well, okay, so as long as that we know we're not grossly underestimating what's going on.
Meryl, you briefly mentioned the treatments. You had some examples in Africa and different land uses. How many treatments altogether are you looking at? And are there major gaps that you want to fill?
Yeah, so altogether, we had about 35 different treatments. I mean, if you look at the same system, say slightly different fertilizer inputs and count those as treatments. The main gap is livestock. There's no data from livestock, and that's actually a major gap that our program is trying to fill. We're actually just moving into phase 2 of the CCAPS program, and so we're really focusing on livestock. We're starting a big project in Latin America, quantifying livestock emissions, and then another big project in East Africa. And part of that is also in quantifying, developing lower cost methods. So can you just, actually one of the methods is taking a manure sample, and then you can just know what the methane emissions were from that animal.
Let's take one more question.
I just was curious, do you have a sense that there's field researchers running all over these countries? Can you get more numbers? Because it seems like there's a few numbers there and they're being extrapolated to this large scale estimate.
No, there isn't, no. And I would say that, well, that's not entirely true. In Latin America, at least my sense is that there is, a lot more work going on. I know there's field work going on in Colombia and Brazil and Costa Rica. In Africa, there's very little. What's going on is probably mostly what we're funding or what we're working on with partners and universities. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Meryl.
Thanks, Dave.